Monica, thank you. First of all, thank you for coming. It's a great honor and pleasure to see you here. I would say that's quite an important event that you managed to publish your book on death in Berlin, as you say. So my question will be, so in your book, there are quite a lot of very important topics which you raise in your book. But one of the most relevant to the present conference is that's how in the 30s, when the Nazis came into power, they managed to recreate or create the cult of the dead, people who died in the First World War, which in Europe, First World War and its results were very crucial for transformation of European societies and a huge traumatic experience. And so so many people who lost their lives was quite a blow for everyone, and of course in Germany first of all. Could you explain a little bit, because it's one of the chapters, it's just devoted to this topic, how Hitler and his clique managed to create this mobilization through SMS hysteria or euphoria, but dealing with this new cult of the dead and how to commemorate the people who has fallen during the First World War.
Yes. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Now? Yes. Good. Good. I'm glad. If I speak too unclearly or too quickly, please tell me, because if I become nervous, I may talk too fast. So I'll try not to be nervous.
I'll be a watchdog,
That's good. Irina's question is very interesting. What happens in Germany after the First World War is that, unlike the case, for example, in France, where the dead of the First World War could be... It's not that the memory of the dead in France, for example, wasn't problematic, because politically it was enormously problematic that so many millions of young people had lost their lives in the war. But at least in France or in Britain, people could say, well, we defended democracy against authoritarianism. Or in Russia, people could say, well, forget the First World War, now the revolution has happened and there's a new world to build. There was something else happening that was, could give meaning to death or could distract people from what had happened and give them something else to concentrate their energies on. In Germany, that was not the case. The memory of the war was not just one in which millions of young people had died, but for which there was no compensation of any kind. And in fact, depending on where you fell in the political spectrum, the particular meaning that you felt that deaths in the war had differed enormously. If you were a socialist, you saw the deaths in the war being associated with the problem of industrial capitalism. If you were, if you were a fascist, the deaths in the war were the sort of ground on which you were going to build a new society. So the fascists in Germany, the Nazis, became obsessed with the idea that the dead, the sacrifice of the dead could not go unrequited. It had somehow to be acknowledged, and it had to be, people had to be reminded of it as often as possible. And of course, the Nazis also developed a cult of their own dead, that is to say, the dead of what the Nazis called their period of struggle in the early years of the party, when they would go on the street and fight with communists, and some of their people would be lost. They blended the deaths associated with the time in which they were struggling to build their movement. They blended these deaths together with the deaths of the First World War as though they were some kind of continuous whole. And then they insisted constantly that everyone remember the sacrifice of the dead. So moving into the 1930s, when the Nazis began to achieve real political power in Germany, and then in fact when they take control of the state, they continue constantly to invoke this message of the sacrifice of the dead, and they use the dead as a kind of instrument to galvanize their form of politics. But I would also say too that it's not as simple as that. That's one thing you can say, that the Nazis were able to instrumentalize or to use the memory of the memory of the dead's sacrifice, if you will, or what they call the sacrifice of the dead. But it's also the case that militarism, and this is more subtle, militarism was a strong tradition in Germany well before the First World War, of course. So after the First World War, militarism becomes, I would say in some ways, an even greater part of everyday life in subtle ways. So that in funerals, for example, you see at ordinary civilian funerals, you see people singing military songs. Their father died in an accident or something, and so they sing a military song at his funeral. The symbols of military death get absorbed into the funeral rituals of ordinary civilian burials. This ideal of masculine, heroic death gets absorbed into all of the symbols of ordinary funeral ritual. When I wrote the book, which is now translated into Russian, Death in Berlin, when I wrote this book, one of the things I was interested in was there are things that people don't talk about in the historical record. They're not written down. But we have images of the practices people used. We have descriptions of practices, and it's in these descriptions of funerary practices, of the practices of death, of funeral rituals, where you can see some of these more subtle ways in which everyday life had absorbed the values of militarism, for example. So that it's not just a story of the instrumentalization of the dead by the state. That's one part of the story. The other piece of the story is the subtle way that people took emotional sustenance in popular culture from this idealization of the dead and wanted somehow for all kinds of funerary rituals to reflect a kind of communion with the dead. Even cemeteries, which until the 1920s had been quite elaborate in Germany, big stone monuments to the dead, suddenly even cemeteries, ordinary civilian cemeteries, start looking like military cemeteries. The gravestones get smaller and more uniform. So that's a subtle thing, but that's the kind of stuff that I was interested in tracing.
I think that's my question. I think quite important to the present Russian situation in a way. So the problem of commemorizing the dead, I would say in the post-war Germany. So there were two options, and usually either to lament about the individual loss, or this is the other way which is not chosen, it's glorification of the war in a way. So instead of mourning the dead in a way, they created, as you said, the cult of the dead. So in a way, psychologically, of course, for people who lost the loved one in the war, that was, quite, I would say, in a way, satisfaction to realize that the people died for nothing in a way, but that was a mission. On the other hand, that's bearing this individual loss and marginalizing it and creating this heroic history of losses. I would say that was a part of mobilization of people and so suppressing the real memories about the horrors of the war. So that was a glorification of war itself,
yes,
as the thing. At least I think that's what we can read from the book, which created it was the master historian that elaborated this military parades, glorifying the dead, and of course preparation for the Second World War in this way.
Yes.
But my question is, and you paid quite a lot of attention to it, how it was reproduced, this idea, this militaristic idea, this mobilization, through what means? This is, as friends said, through mass culture, in a way. Could you explain a bit how it was instrumented in the culture and everyday practices?
It's a very interesting thing, and it's very difficult to say how the practices of everyday life, what are the mechanisms through which the practices of everyday life change? That's a very difficult thing to, I don't think, I mean, there are anthropologists who have good and very interesting cultural theories about how everyday life practices change. But I'm not sure that I was able to determine in this book why, for example, it suddenly became attractive to people to have military-like burials for non-soldiers. I would assume that there was some emotional compensation.
Could it say that it was glorification of death in a way? That's, you know, that's what's, I can't judge in a way, but what's not introduced, it's a kind of, if you say, cult of the dead, but with the death in general. So death stops becoming, you know, a tragedy. It doesn't belong to individual loss, but somehow, strange enough, belongs to the country in general, even the death of a non-military person. Could we explain it, yes, to the nation?
Yeah, that's exactly right. No, that's a very good point. So one of the things that happens in Germany is that people are, I think that you can see traces of this in other cultures too, in France, but it's not the same. There's a sense in which in Germany after the First World War, and it begins during the war actually, it begins, you could see it happening in 1916, 1917. People in Germany deny that the dead are dead. And that's not sort of, I don't mean that metaphorically, I mean quite literally that people deny the death of the dead. They say that the dead are still among us, they're still living, they're still judging us, they know that we are not appreciating their sacrifice, they know that we are not respecting their memory. And this continues into the 1920s and into the 1930s, this idea that the dead are not really gone. They're still among us, they still speak to us. And you see this in Germany. What's interesting about that is you see that right across the political spectrum. Not among communists, perhaps, but even among socialists and all the way to the right, you see people invoking the dead as though they were alive, constantly. And of course the Nazis continued that tradition, and I would say that that tradition continues in some areas of German culture well after 1945, where it's not so much that you don't find people expressing the idea that the dead are still walking among us after 1945, but there are many ways in which this cult of the dead, which is initiated in the mid-teens, you know, during the First World War, can still see traces of its effects long after 1945, in the sense that school children in Germany were taken out to, in West Germany, not in East Germany, but in West Germany, school children were taken out to tend the graves of the dead. And they were instructed in the proper procedure for dealing with the graves of the dead, as though the connection between the living and the dead needed to be one that was constantly reinforced, and how you treated the dead was somehow symbolic of your national identity in a very, very core way. So that's a bit of...
Yeah, you know, and what I'm really interested in, and you wrote a chapter on this, how this new cult of the dead were instrumented in the Nazi Germany through different types of media and mass culture. How did they manage to do it? By the way, I just remember that even in the 60s, in the Soviet Union, when I was still a kid, it was quite a usual thing. It kind of open burials when, you know, the open coffin was brought through the street with the orchestra. You know, it stopped, I think, in the end of the 60s. You know, probably that was a real change, the social change somehow. Probably new generation came, which was not so militarized in a way. But as we say about this pseudo-military burials, they existed in the post-war Russia as well. So, but what about mass media? How the Nazis produced this new cult of death and this mobilization of mass hysteria for this?
Yeah, I would say that the way that they consolidated their particular view of death, and of course the Nazis had this very heroic, very masculine ideal of death, which found its greatest expression in military death. They disseminated that idea in a million different ways, through poetry, through films, through, I think the most interesting thing that they did, which the Nazis are not the only regime that ever did this, but the Nazis did it with particular enthusiasm, was they created a whole set of burial rituals, and they did deep study of this. I mean, they had anthropologists and folklorists whose job it was to look at the death rituals that were to be found in the most ancient German texts, like Germania, and texts like this. They went back and looked, how did the most ancient Germans bury their dead? This is how we should bury the dead. So that they wanted to make some kind of seamless cultural continuity between themselves and their earliest forebears in terms of how they buried the dead. So the Nazis created a whole series of rituals for burying the dead, and they had burials for children, for men, for women who were not mothers, for women who were mothers, for grandmothers. I mean, they had for every sort of category of human being in Nazi society, they had a different sort of set of burial rituals, and each of these sets of rituals carried its own symbolism. You know, whether at the burial of a child you wouldn't necessarily use fire, but at the burial of a young man you might use pits of flame. Oak leaves would be used as symbolism in all German burial rites. So this is one of the ways they had, you know, through their own magazines and various forms of mass literature, they disseminated these ideas about how, if you're German, you should bury the dead, how you should think about the dead, what your funeral should look like, this sort of thing.
Yes, and you know, I think what I really liked in your book in a way that you've shown that after the World War II, you know, the result of this mass hysteria which produced the Second World War II, how through the, again, transformation of these burial rituals, all these heroic statues of dead just started collapsing. And I think that's quite a lot of moving scenes, how, you know, in the Bond in Berlin, so many people looked for coffins because they didn't want to bury, you know, their loved ones simply in the ground. And so all this really heroic militarist vision of the death just started disappearing. Could you say a few words how this humanization of society were produced in these changing rituals of burial and commemoration?
Yes, I mean, so what happens after the Second World War is that, particularly in the city of Berlin, you couldn't say this about Germany generally because it's, you know, I would say that the history of death is always a local history because customs are quite different from place to place to place. But in Berlin, at the end of the war, because of the fighting at the end of the war, there were an enormous number of people who could not be buried in individual graves, which was the expected tradition, that human beings get buried in individual graves. And since that couldn't take place, in lots of cases, people buried their own dead. And they invented rituals or let's say they tried to reproduce the normative rituals of death, even in that very catastrophic situation at the end of the war. After that experience in what becomes West Berlin and what becomes East Berlin, there are a whole set of new pressures and a whole set of new forces at work. So in the West, there's less of an official position. The state doesn't have an official position about the meaning of death. At least it doesn't articulate one, let's say. In the East, there was somewhat of a more official position in the sense that the communist state in East Germany was more interested in celebrating the ideals of socialism and in trying to build socialism in a country that 5 minutes ago was extraordinarily hostile to communism, of course, trying to build socialism in a country like that. And part of that effort eventually becomes the attempt to also reform the practices of everyday life, including the rituals of burial. That effort ultimately is relatively successful, actually. By the late 1980s in East Germany, the rituals of burial were quite dramatically transformed. It's not clear whether they were transformed because of the general secularization of East German society or because of some other pressures, but they are transformed. In West Berlin, it's much more difficult to say because, again, people don't articulate, unlike in Nazi society or in communist society, liberal society doesn't necessarily articulate a position about what death means or what the burial of the dead means. So it's a bit more difficult to say what's happening there. But those are some of the transformations that we see after the war. And of course, one of the most important things for destroying the cult of the dead that had existed in Nazi Germany is the fact that the Allies, the Soviets, the Americans, the British, the French, don't allow this cult of the dead to continue. I mean, at a certain level, they mow down Nazi statuary and they chip swastikas off of buildings, and all of the sort of accoutrements that had gone along with creating that image, a particular Nazi image of death, is wiped out by the Allies. So that's a big part of the story as well, of course.
Thank you, but I think we just logically continue to your present paper, because as I understand that your present paper is dealing with a new wave of mass hysteria, but as a kind of impact and aftermath of the Second World War. And so just crushing this military cult of the dead. As I understand it, the German society started, the process of healing. And so what happens in this situation, how this new type of, I would say, self-mobilization, just started through some different means. Yeah. So probably you will continue with your paper about this great German healer, which appeared after the war. And in Russian it sounds какова была массовая истерия, чудесные исцеления и апокалиптические ожидания общества в Западной Германии после Второй мировой войны. Okay, we should start with the paper.
Yes.
But I highly advertise the book, and I think it's quite revealing, and the Russian history, not only of the past, but probably of the present as well. And I want to thank Vlad Tretjakov, who was a very good translator, and he did his work very good. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. I want to say a couple of words briefly before I start talking about the subject of my paper today, which is I want to say what an enormous honor it is for me to be here. I have been reading about Memorial for many years. We, in the United States, Memorial has I don't think a person on the street would necessarily know about Memorial, but people who read about Russian culture and Russian ideas and Russian history know about it, certainly. And of course, there have been articles about it in important magazines in the United States, and so it's an enormous honor. It's an enormous thrill and honor to meet Irina, and to see my book appear in a Russian translation is maybe one of the great thrills of my life. So that is a wonderful thing for me, and I want to thank Vlad Tretjakov. Is that?
He's there.
Thank you very much. We had very many interesting conversations about translating from German to English and then into Russian. That was very interesting. And I also want to thank Alex Ruslov for all of the preparations that he made for me to come here. It's just a thrill, really, and a great honor. So my paper today is called What Was Mass Hysteria? Faith Healing and Popular Apocalypticism in Post-War Germany. And so I'll start. In March 1949, word began circulating around Herford. Is this the... Yeah, there, good. Can you see it?
No.
Not really. It may just be a problem with the...
Turn up the light.
Can you see now?
Yes.
Good. It's just a map. Herford's a little city. I wouldn't expect you to know where it was. I certainly didn't know where it was. In March 1949, that's an important detail, word began circulating around Herford, a Westphalian city in what would soon become the Federal Republic of Germany, that a Messiah was in town and healing the sick. At least that's what people said, that a young boy named Dieter Hülsmann, who suffered from muscular dystrophy and had been in bed for some 10 weeks, unable to stand or walk, had suddenly stood up and, assisted by an obscure wonder worker, had taken several hesitant steps. This was immediately hailed as a miracle, and as rumors of it spread out from Herford, the Hülsmann family villa at Wilhelmsplatz number 7 began to be besieged with visitors, well-wishers, cure seekers, not to mention scores of the merely curious. Cars, trucks, even whole buses began lining the well-heeled neighborhood's streets as ailing people streamed into town. And soon hundreds and just thousands of them were sleeping on the train stations, benches, and in hotels, and even on the lawn of the Hülsmann family's home here. Soon thousands of people were sleeping on the lawn, waiting to meet this wonder worker whom they had heard had cured this young boy. With the cure seekers came reporters, and with them stories of spontaneous healings began circulating far outside Herford, an ancient and industrious but otherwise unremarkable city of some 50,000, known chiefly for the manufacture of cigars, sweets, and kitchen furniture. They called it the miracle of Herford. Adults and children, whether in wheelchairs, mobile only on crutches, or indeed confined to bed for years, were suddenly standing up and walking around. People with trouble speaking could talk without hesitation or constraint. Pain endured for months or years vanished. The deaf could hear, the blind could see. At the center of this drama of healing, it turned out, was an eccentric figure named Bruno Gröning. This is a picture of him. Almost nothing was known about him. Yet after a short treatment involving little more than sitting with Dieter, the boy, and rubbing his legs, Gröning had helped the boy to walk. Almost as extraordinary, once a fuller picture began to take shape, were the healer's claims about himself, about God, about his power, about nature, good and evil, health and sickness. I am here to let the nation be healed, Gröning said in 1949 in Frankfurt. Only God could heal the sick, he said, and he, Gröning, was God's instrument on earth. I have unleashed things you speak of as miracles, he said to one observer, but they are not miracles, they are matters of fact. For a time, Gröning's name was on the lips of nearly everyone in occupied Germany. Politicians, city and regional officials, medical doctors, university professors, police investigators, lawyers, psychiatrists, people in the street, members of the press, and the clergy. For his army of detractors, and there were many, Gröning was a fraud, a charlatan, a dangerous lunatic, a sexual deviant, the leader of a cult, a harbinger and inciter of mass hysteria. For his acolytes, however, Gröning was nothing short of a messiah. They called him miracle doctor, miracle healer, wonder worker, cure bringer, even savior. Though his media presence would ebb and flow over time, he remained a subject of fascination and horror in the Federal Republic of Germany until his death in 1959. His utterances and mass healings, where tens of thousands of people gathered, hoping to meet him, to say nothing of his legal battles, court appearances, and bitter public disputes with some of his former disciples, fed the press a steady diet of intrigue and mystery throughout the 1950s. And of course, we could leave it at that. Perhaps the phenomenon of Bruno Gröning is just, and his tens of thousands of faithful, is just one of those moments in history when, for no reason at all, human beings become captivated by a particular idea, a voice, a vision, and are temporarily transported out of this world of the everyday, or are mysteriously galvanized into what appears to be irrational action by delusions or terror. However, this appears to me, as a historian, to generalize and even medicalize a set of phenomena that had their own quite distinctive social meanings and emerged in a very particular context. So I would like to talk a little bit about that context and inquire a bit further into this figure and what I think some of what was happening, I think, in the background of his emergence. What did it mean in 1949 that Gröning's cures, for example, were immediately heralded as miracles? Not just by the people who were cured by him, but in the press. The press routinely referred to Gröning's cures as miracles. More pointedly, what did it mean to be a messiah after Hitler? In 1949, Hitler was a dead and generally, though not by any means entirely, discredited prophet dictator. Styled as a savior, he had styled himself as a savior. That prophet had led Germany into a war motivated in no small measure by apocalyptic visions of purity and what Nazis saw as an existential battle between good and evil. Hitler would frequently appear in the background of discussions of Gröning and what it meant that thousands of Germans would wait in the rain for days just to catch a glimpse of him. There had been mystical healers in German history before, actually quite recently. In the 1930s, there were very popular faith healers in Germany. And there's a tradition of magical healing in Germany as well. In the 1930s, a journalist whose name was Rudolf Olden had written a story about a famous faith healer named Joseph Weisinger. And he said this, he said, miracles are as much a product of history and environment as the ordinary and the banal. And I would say if that's true, and I think that is true, then time and place matters to how we understand the Gröning phenomenon. Because this phenomenon followed very closely on the heels of Nazism, the Nazis' exterminatory war and genocide. And it took shape in the context of the escalating Cold War and the possibility of nuclear annihilation. So the Gröning episode took on quite distinct public proportions. There is no healer in 20th century history, though there are earlier examples. There is no healer in 20th century German history who comes close to occupying the mental space in Germany that Gröning did. It turns out, and this is what I will try to show over the course of the rest of my paper, that Gröning was in just the right place at just the right time, making his emergence and his works appear, for those inclined to look for it, to have been set in motion by the hand of God. People who described Gröning in 1949 and 1950 obsessively described every aspect of his physical appearance, his facial expressions, his gestures, his manner of speaking. He had, people said, a penetrating gaze. He was lean, yet exuded vitality. One journalist referred to him as gaunt and fever-eyed and commented on his short-fingered, unkempt hands. Others spoke of his prominent goiter or remarked on his long, oily hair. He ate very little, they said, and slept less, but smoked endlessly. He liked to be alone in cemeteries or in forests, and would spend hours contemplating blades of grass and developing friendships with squirrels and other small creatures. Even as a child, people who had known him said, the sick felt better just standing near him. Simply put, at least in terms of his media representations, Bruno Gröning was not quite of this world. Even West Germany's reflexively ironic and skeptical news weekly, The Spiegel, emphasized the healer's tendency to wear black, suggesting something cultish. And here's the cover of Bruno Gröning on the cover of the Spiegel in 1949. Being a holy man, however, did not have to imply otherworldliness. Many descriptions praised Gröning's simplicity, his earthiness, his lack of formal knowledge and training. Some mocked his poor standard German. Others hailed his speech as merely unadorned and authentic and uncorrupted. As for himself, Gröning emphasized his artlessness as evidence of his connection to God. He said at one point, "My power is not human, but divine. I am no miracle doctor, I am the little Gröning." Gröning's devotees linked his appearance unambiguously to the reign of Christ, and in huge gatherings around him, they would sing hymns and they would shout, "Thy kingdom come." Within weeks of his arrival in Herford, city officials were so alarmed by the scale of the crowds who had descended on their town that they banned Gröning from treating the sick in their city. In response to the ban, a man wrote to the city manager of the city of Herford, and he said, "If Christ were on earth now, people would treat him just like Gröning." Another woman wrote later to say that the banning of Gröning was like the crucifixion of our Lord Jesus Christ 2,000 years ago. Herr Bruno Gröning, she said, is the good Son of God. So how should we understand this? Gröning is not just heralded as a wonder worker, but as the good Son of God, as an angel of the Lord, people said, as a Messiah, as a Savior. I'm going to sketch out now briefly something which I would think of as the sort of modern history of popular apocalypticism in Germany, which is a kind of unwritten history in Germany, I would say. This is sort of a part of the project that I'm working on now, which deals with this healer. And I'm trying to embed him in various ways in various aspects of popular culture and the history of everyday life in German history. And one of these aspects of everyday life is the history of popular apocalypticism and religious prophecy in Germany, which I'd say is quite a strong history in the first part of the 20th century, but which is virtually unwritten. Most of the work that has been done on apocalypticism in German history is in the realm of intellectual history, right? From the nationalist era up through National Socialism, but not after 1945. So that's another piece of the contribution of my work, I would say. And usually, when people in German history have written about apocalypticism, they look at apocalypticism, apocalyptic thinking, as a secular phenomenon. I don't think it's a secular phenomenon. There is secular apocalypticism in German history, but what I'm going to talk about is religious apocalypticism. So, already before the First World War, people saw in Germany a flourishing of what were called new religious movements outside the conventional Christian confessional divide in Germany, which is a Protestant-Catholic divide. But outside of this divide, you begin to see the development of a lot of new groups who don't easily belong to either one of those religious categories. One of these communities was called the New Apostolic Community, and in the city of Berlin alone, this movement had 20,000 adherents. And New Apostolic communities were groups who took very special inspiration from the Book of Revelation. And they spoke about themselves as a group who were living at the edge of the end times. They thought they were living through the last generations of the end of the world. The eschatological and apocalyptic fervor of these groups had begun to ebb away, actually, before 1914, but with the war, it comes roaring back. And throughout the period of the First World War in Germany, we see all kinds of evidence of the re-emergence of apocalyptic thinking in popular culture. You see the emergence of scores of fortune tellers, diviners, and people writing about apocalyptic prophecy during the war, people predicting the outcome of the war and what will happen if Germany loses, what will happen if Germany wins. Some of the prophecies that they rely upon dated actually to the Napoleonic era, or even earlier, so that you see this kind of reinvigoration of the memory of things like the Napoleonic Wars. And these wartime predictions and wartime apocalyptic thinking included the kind of dualistic motifs that we often see in apocalyptic thought. Structures of good and evil, righteous and damned, annihilation and rebirth. Right? These are the themes of this literature. And we can see it in all kinds of different sources, in war verse, war poetry, in war propaganda generated by the state, in theology, which is less surprising, of course. After 1918, of course, defeat in Germany was followed by revolution and by the tumultuous events of the 1920s and 30s, hyperinflation, putsch attempts, coup attempts, government by emergency decree. And I would say that for Germans of a particular outlook, who are inclined to see the end times coming, these kinds of events only confirmed their view that the end of days were upon them. The onset of the Great Depression brought to the streets barefoot prophets and people who were called inflation holy men. These were literally men who came to the streets dressed in robes, like Jesus, with no shoes on, preaching the end times. This is a very popular sort of feature of big cities in Germany in the years after the First World War. Hitler was, in a sense, one of these people. He didn't wear a robe, he wore a uniform instead of a robe, and he wore shoes, but he was one of these people who styled himself as a kind of redeemer, as a redeemer figure, someone who was going to save Germany from the end. And not a few people in Germany, and certainly the adherents of the Nazi Party, came to see his rise, came to see Hitler himself and his political rise, and the coming of the Third Reich as a kind of sign that history was not moving meaninglessly or randomly. When Nazi supporters themselves referred, as they sometimes did, to a 1,000-year Reich, right? They called the Third Reich a 1,000-year Reich, they not only gave themselves a name with deep biblical overtones and the power of magic numbers, they were trying to predict the future. Hitler himself read himself into the book of Revelation as one divinely chosen to initiate the Third Reich, to initiate this new world that he believed he was setting in motion. In the Nazi version of history, Hitler featured as a savior, as a redeemer, who would rescue the German nation and lead a godly realm to an ultimate triumph over evil, light over darkness, as the Nazis defined these things. And this sensibility, of course, also motivated, in some degree, Nazi war. There was a very recent book, a very interesting recent book, that has argued that this motivation for Nazi war was not merely a kind of secular motivation, but an entirely religious one, and that Nazi apocalypticism and the genocide that grew out of it were concerned with clearing the slate of time. That's in a way what the war, what the Holocaust was about. Re-establishing and purifying origins and rewriting history to suit a revolutionary millennial age. In the final months of World War II, all manner of apocalyptic scenarios agitated Germany. Some predicted that Germans would be wiped out if the war was lost and called for fanatical resistance. There's also evidence from the post-war era that suggests that the book of Revelation once again circulated, certain passages of it circulated throughout Germany by word of mouth. And all sorts of rumors and nightmarish visions circulated throughout the country as the war was coming to an end. Earlier prophecies and folk legends and the various flotsam of collective memory were now recovered, re-examined for new meaning, and embroidered with new motifs and pieces of lore borrowed from various printed sources and passed around by word of mouth. But in early 1949, getting back to Bruno Gröning now, a quite special class of specific rumors about the imminent end of the world began to circulate. These rumors soon reached such a pitch of intensity, they had become so commonplace, that they captured the attention of a scholar of prehistory named Alfred Dieck. Alfred Dieck he studied bog bodies. Do you know bog bodies are these bodies that they're like Bronze Age human beings who are buried in parts of Northern Europe, in Germany, in the British Isles, in Scandinavia, probably in Russia too, I would think, in some places. They're bodies that are preserved in the bogs, and they can be, when they're found, they can be examined for to learn various aspects of prehistory. So Alfred Dieck was a student of these bodies, but now he decided to turn his attention to these rumors of the end of the world, which were becoming more and more insistent in 1949. Now remember, this is not 1945, it's 1949, right? 4 years after the war. So Dieck made a study of these rumors, and he found that while rumors of the end of the world had originated in popular culture through word of mouth, they had quickly made their way into the newspapers. So the newspapers would report, "The end of the world is coming." Headlines read things like, "Apocalypse!" exclamation point. "On March 17th, the world will end." Or, "Families want to be together for the end of the world." And these were printed in quite legitimate newspapers as jokes. But they weren't perceived as jokes by a lot of people. And so what would happen is people would read the headline, "The world is ending," and then they would tell their neighbors, "I read in the newspaper that the world is ending." And they would say, "I read in the newspaper that the world is ending on March 17th. No, I heard it's on the 18th. I heard it's on the 19th. And so people would debate this, and this is what Dieck wrote about in his study of these end-of-the-world rumors. Dieck's theory was, and this probably makes sense to us, that the powerful belief that people had formerly invested in Hitler had then been sort of transferred in 1945 to an army of astrologists and clairvoyants and people like this who had emerged, as they had done in 1918, to fill the breach in knowledge that opened up when the world, as many Germans had known it, collapsed in 1945. So rather than filling that breach, Dieck said, the Allies appeared to most Germans to be treacherous and untrustworthy. They sponsored unpopular policies like the industrial disarmament policy, whereby various German factories were broken down and carted away to the United States or to the Soviet Union or where else, which continued well into the 50s. There were also constant sort of East-West tensions, of course, the sort of early years of the Cold War. And Dieck also blamed scandal-driven American popular culture. He said American popular culture is partly to blame for these end times prophecies. He's probably not wrong about that either. And he also said that a newly sensationalist press, of course, had also fed the rumors. And this makes sense too because, the press had been totalitarian regime's press until then. It said what the state wanted it to say, and now suddenly the newspapers could say whatever they wanted, and what they did was print ridiculous stories about the end of the world. Then Dieck noticed that just around February, the beginning of March 1949, suddenly these rumors became even more agitated, and he started hearing even more of them. And people said, it's coming, we know that it's going to happen soon. And just at this moment, a radio station in Hamburg decided to air a broadcast of something that was called a catastrophe play, in which the world, the Earth, is threatened by an enormous meteor shower that's going to wipe out all life on Earth. So it's this combination of things that's making people particularly anxious. And it was in just that moment, and in just that place, in northwestern Germany, that Gröning appeared. Right? Gröning had been healing people in Germany for years before this, and no one was particularly interested in him. Suddenly, he appears in this place. It is said that he's healed this child of his paralysis, and now an enormous phenomenon breaks out. Why was this moment in Hereford so different? I would say that perhaps the tendency to tease out of the chaos of events some ultimate sense in history coming on the tail end of a series of terrifying rumors about the end of the world might hold some clue. Perhaps people were simply waiting, in other words, for Gröning or someone like him to appear. When he then, speaking in the name of God, cured a young boy of a terrible illness that had made him unable to walk, it was rumored, When he, it was said, told the boy simply to go outside and play, and the boy did that, some told, Groening affirmed an image of the healer as the anointed one, an image embedded in a long history of spiritual medicine dating back as far as, and probably much longer than, the time of Jesus of Nazareth. For those prepared to see things this way, Groening's miraculous cures confirmed that he was the anointed one, and being the anointed one, confirmed the reality of his miracles. That he was said also to have possessed very specific other gifts, clairvoyance, for example, or, some people said, the ability to raise the dead, only enhanced his claims to a divine connection. Having been banned from healing in Hereford, and then all of North Rhine-Westphalia, and then Hamburg by the summer and fall of 1949, Groening moved south to a place called Rosenheim, which is near Munich. And enormous crowds began forming spontaneously there to meet him, simply on rumors that he might show up. The crowds became so big that the Red Cross had to erect tents to shelter the thousands of supplicants, and local municipalities laid straw in the market halls for people to sleep on at night. The atmosphere and outpouring of emotion inspired further prophetic visions. To me, it seems that we are living at the end of time, preached a Benedictine visiting from Italy to the crowds in Rosenheim that September. Quoting from the prophet Joel, he continued, "And at the end of days, says the Lord, I will pour out my spirit, and it will have the face of men and heal." Groening seemed himself at this point to be a portent registering the course of events, the meaning and fate of the universe, and tracing out the cosmic horizon against which history is set. In other words, he became the sign confirming other signs of redemption, of renewed faith, of the possibility of miracles. Some believed that Groening had initiated the New Age, in other words. Now, opponents of Groening, and I'll finish now, just a few more things. Opponents of Groening saw the phenomenon that he helped to inspire as an instance of what they called mass hysteria. And in doing so, they connected their own time, their own present in 1949, to a genealogy that branched back, in its modern variant at least, to the 19th century. A century with a particular dread of the crowd as irrational and primitive, feminized, de-individualized, lacking all sense of responsibility, infectious in its violent tendencies, and pathological. Yet the crowds around Groening were inspired neither by fear, nor loathing, nor violence. They wanted to be healed, and I think we should understand this both literally and metaphorically. Elaine Pagels, who's an American historian of early Christianity, wrote a book about Revelation, about the book of Revelation in the Bible. She notes that while terrible human crises can produce end times fantasies, they can also prompt spiritual breakthroughs, new alignments, and can provoke or prompt renewal or return to God, she says, or to the good. From the vantage point of 1949, Germans had lived through various moments that they not unreasonably viewed as cataclysmic. During the Third Reich, at least after a certain point, their government intentionally spread false rumors to divert attention from the increasingly doom-laden course of the war. When this became untenable, the state turned to propagating terrifying rumors of what defeat would look like. And so it's no surprise that apocalyptic scenarios bloomed in popular culture after the war, and that they were spread not only by word of mouth, but also in the newspaper, suggesting that a free post-Nazi, post-fascist press was not necessarily a responsible or even informative one. In this mire of uncertainty and foreboding and distrust, Groening was, if not a messiah, then I would say at least for some, a figure of hope whose wondrous therapeutic abilities verified his connection to God. That's that. Thank you very much.
usual practice, and then we have some time for questions.
Thank you, Monica, for your wonderful paper, and thank you for your wonderful paper, and it opens up a new vision on this very difficult and tumultuous period after the Second World War, and it also calls for many parallels. But I actually want to, my question is, I have a small factual question about Groening, whether he in any way benefited from the situation. Personally, did he gain anything from it? Just practically. But my question for the first part of the presentation, and I look forward to reading your book, it's because my background is history of psychiatry. And I know that the people during, just after the First World War, who lost their relatives and loved ones, they did want a communion with them. And one of the ways to have this communion, to reunite with the lost members of the family, was to spiritualism, just spiritualism as спиритические сеансы, with the help of mediums. And do you write in your, do you have this chapter in your book, or in some ways? And of course it's a very important issue, the instrumentalization of death by the state. But before that, we have a real human longing to get their loved ones back. And there are some irrational ways to do it. And also, I think it's very important, one of the very important consequences of your research is the brethren cemeteries. Another chapter would be brethren cemeteries, because the culture of brethren cemeteries, братские кладбища, is booming after the First World War. They were there before, but after the First World War, there's a very interesting, from the point of view of art and architecture and sculpture, an interesting culture of brethren cemeteries. And I wonder whether you can comment on that. And also to answer my first pragmatic question.
Yes. So the first question, so that's a very complicated, the answer to that question about, I want to apologize for not being able to address you in Russian, by the way. But I wish I could. That would be lovely if I could do that. Maybe someday. To answer your first question, it's a very complicated thing to answer, actually, because Groening was, and I don't want to derail the whole conversation by getting into this discussion, but Groening was not just a faith healer, he was an exorcist. Okay? And there's a tradition of this, an unwritten, I would say, history of this in German culture. And we can see lots of different kinds of examples of it. So Groening was not just interested in sort of waving hands over people and then pronouncing them well, he was interested in extracting the devil from them, right? That was causing them to be sick. Groening believed that as a person with the ability to do that, he could not take money for what he did, because if he took money, he would lose his ability. That doesn't mean, however, that he didn't benefit materially in certain ways. So people around him would take little donations that people gave. I mean really small donations, and sometimes things like a bottle of schnapps, a ham, a block of cheese, some bacon, right? Maybe a little bit of money. And they would collect this money, and he lived from it, but he didn't handle money himself. So he's not like some of our faith healers in the United States who become very rich from casting out demons. So that's the answer. That's the part of the answer to your factual question. The question about spiritualism is interesting. I didn't write a lot about spiritualism. First, because there's a very famous book in English by a guy named Jay Winter, who teaches at Yale University, which is about spiritualism in France and Britain, and it deals a little bit with Germany. Not very much. And actually, it's not clear to me that spiritualism was quite as big a phenomenon in Germany as it had been in France and Britain. And I wonder if this was in part because, I didn't write about it, but I wonder if this was in part because of this cult of the living dead. The belief is already that the dead are around, so we don't need to conjure them, right? But that's an interesting question. And then spiritualism, for whatever reason, this is something I don't completely understand myself. Spiritualism dies out after the Second World War. You would think you would see a big resurgence of spiritualism. You don't really see that, at least not in Germany, maybe in other places. And then you asked a question about cemeteries, but I missed a piece of it. What kind of cemeteries?
Brethren.
What
That's
are they?
common, you know, if you take bodies and put it in the same set, which was...
Like a mass grave?
Yes, mass grave, yeah.
Yes, I do write about that, yes. I do. I mean, there are interesting examples in Berlin of mass burials of Soviet soldiers in particular. Maybe you know about Treptow Park, this enormous memorial in Treptow Park. Awesome, amazing. Every time I go to Berlin, I go to look at it because I think it's such an incredible piece of work and of artwork and just a moment in time captured in this place. But you do see mass burials in Berlin, but the Germans are very concerned about them, and they want them dug up as soon as it becomes possible to dig them up and find the pieces and rebury them individually. They do this. If it's possible to do it, they do it. Which is, to me, is an amazing thing, that in an atmosphere where people don't have enough to eat, and there's no electricity, and there's no water, and there's no gas, and everything is collapsed, the first concern is, I have to dig up my mother and move her, you know? Does it address your question? Yeah.
Any other questions or comments?
Thank you. Monica, thank you for a wonderful presentation, and I also have a question pertaining to your book and then to your presentation. And speaking about your book and about this presence of dead among the living population, it really reminds me of a very archaic way of, treating death. And this is something that I think is observable in radical revolutionary cults, as well as in many new nationalist movements, projects. And it's always, I think, indicates the power of myth and mythological consciousness, where you have to reenact this initial master narrative, this mythological master narrative every time in order to persist as a community. And I think it also has a lot to do with underdevelopment of institutional basis for these communities, like rising national movements or radical revolutionary movements that can't really rely on a set of established institutions, and they have to reinvent themselves as a community based on shared mythology. So my question is whether you work with this paradigm at all in your research, and whether this kind of mythological aspect of the post-war social mobilization is relevant. And then this was really fascinating, the story of that you told, and my question is about how far would you go with this general model of social kind of, again, rejuvenation based on this kind of semi-religious mobilization around some figures like healers or saint-like figures at all. So whether this was specifically German, or you would say that this is typical of all, say, post-totalitarian societies. So what is really special about this story, what is specifically German, and as you said, localized, and how far would you go to kind of generalizing about all similar societies?
Yes, I think I'll answer that question first. I think that is a question that I haven't decided yet. It's one of the questions that I'm the most concerned about. The whole book, in a way, is about deciding how particular this is to Germany. You know, there's a tradition in Germany, in writing about German history, to assign anything weird like this to the weirdness of German culture. But it's true. I don't ascribe.
We could compete, you know.
So could we. There's a tendency to ascribe anything that happens that's out of the ordinary. When I say out of the ordinary, what I mean is things that don't fit into a sort of modernist paradigm of what a society is supposed to look like is immediately assigned to the strange thing about German culture that nobody can explain. That, to me, is a bad historical explanation. So, on the other hand, there's something very particular about the rise of Nazism. There's never been anything quite like that. And there's necessarily, because there's never been anything quite like that, there's never been anything quite like the attempt to create something new out of that, right? Or to recover something good after that experience. So that history just is particular. And I don't know if you could, the United States has never been a totalitarian society, but many of these features, faith healers are a common part of the American cultural landscape, right? And imbuing leaders with almost quasi-religious sensibilities gets more, we have that more and more and more in the United States now. So I don't think it's something that is particular just to totalitarian or post-totalitarian societies. But the extent to which it is specific to Germany, I'm still trying to decide. I think it's an excellent question. It's something I'm still trying to figure out. Your other question was about mythology. You know, the whole Nazi project was a project of myth-making. In some ways, very self-conscious myth-making. You know, very self-conscious manipulation of images of the leader and images of the masses. And that is without a doubt. What I'm really interested in as a historian in general is how in everyday life, a little bit like some of the things you and I were speaking about earlier before the session began, how in everyday life do people, how do cultural ideas take shape in everyday life almost at an unconscious level? In other words, not directed by the state, not directed by propaganda, not manipulated. And yet we see these things sort of developing in the sorts of clothing people choose to wear, or the t-shirt motifs in the metro station, right? There are ways that you see that sort of just almost like mushrooms after a rain, right? And how that happens, I think, is very complicated. I'm not sure I have a good theory about it, but that's what I'm interested in, is how can you capture cultural change at the level of everyday life? Not so much manipulated by the state, although that's part of the story. It's always part of the story. But more coming from the grassroots. So, I don't know if that's... Yeah.
Thank you, Monica. It was a fascinating paper, and I enjoyed it particularly because I observed this kind of mass hysteria in another part of the world, which is South Asia. But still, my questions will concern precisely your paper. And one is, could some rational voices be heard at the time of the highest popularity of this person? And the second question is, how big was the territory that fell under his impact?
Yeah, it's a very interesting. Those are both very interesting questions to answer. The first one, I would say, were there rational voices? Could rational voices be heard? This is a difficult thing, I would say, in post-Nazi Germany, to talk about whose voice is rational, because, right, the Nazi infection in Germany was very systemic. It was very broad. it wasn't a chunk of the population. It was most people on one level or another, right? So you will have people calling themselves rational actors. Doctors, for example, didn't like Bruno Gröning. The doctors were the most Nazified profession of all. So I don't trust those people. Do you know what I mean? I don't trust them as having a rational voice. Of course, I understand your question, but that's what I would say, is that one of the things that's very interesting about writing about this person is that you can't trust anybody. None of the sources are trustworthy because all of the people are deeply implicated in the history that had come just before. So that would be my answer to that question. And to your second question, let me remember now. Territory.
How big was it?
Exactly. So it starts out in the north of Germany, it spreads to the south. He becomes a national figure very quickly. Within a couple of months, he's on the cover of the Spiegel, you know, the main news magazine in Germany. He makes a documentary film is made about him, which is broadcast all over the country. So he becomes a national figure, but he also becomes an international figure. He gets invitations from, of course, the United States to come and heal people there. He gets people come from Switzerland, from Austria, from Holland, from Denmark, from all over, from Italy, from Brazil even. People come to meet him. And today, he is a forgotten figure in Germany. Almost no one, even if they are old enough to have been aware at the time, no one remembers him. However, he has a huge internet presence. So if you get on the internet, you will find a website about him in Russian, in Swahili, in Finnish, in English, and in every other language. So, and personally, I know that a friend of mine who goes to a massage therapist, who's also kind of a healer in my town, and this woman is a very brilliant historian of science. She goes to this woman who's a kind of massage therapist healer, and this massage therapist keeps pamphlets in her office about my healer. So it's an interesting question.
There are some people behind these internet sites.
Yes. Who are they? I have to find this out. Part of me doesn't really want to find out. But then it's a very interesting question. So I will ultimately have to find out who's funding those websites.
By the way, could I ask you a question? You know, just speaking about all this mass hysteria, could we judge it? I understand this is awful frustration, quite a lot of losses, the feeling of guilt. So many negative emotions in the society which has lost the war and in many ways were disillusioned by the things. Could we, strange enough, look at this situation as a positive one? So there's clinging to a figure who is not proclaiming death and sacrifice, but on the other hand, just on the contrary, just healing, rejuvenating the country, the people in a way. Could we say that probably he was more positive a figure than a negative one in the post-war Germany?
I think so. I think that's exactly right. I think that he represents something. Now, I think it's actually kind of interesting and complicated. On the one hand, when I said that he wanted to heal people and people wanted to be healed, and I said that we should understand that both literally, you're paralyzed and you want to be able to walk, and metaphorically, what I meant was this. I think that German society after the war was infused with a feeling of enormous failure, of guilt. What people were guilty about is not exactly clear. We know what they should have felt guilty about, but we don't. I'm not saying that the guilt was specific, but there is guilt and negative emotions of those kinds. And I think that he represents a kind of redemption. He represents a figure of redemption. But I also think that he, and not this older figure of redemption, which is apocalyptic and...
He was not destructive. In a way, he proposed some kind of positive thing, well, just heal the nation.
Yes.
So in a way, that's redeeming, that's taking away the guilt, because in one of our sessions, Hans-Ulrich Gumrecht, who's our author, in a way, he told us about this almost mass hysteria in 1954, I think, when the Germans won the World Cup, Football World Cup. That was national celebrations. And in a way, this mass hysteria was some aftermath, again. But unlike that's your hero, that was a kind of, almost pseudo-military victory in a way, which was quite unhealthy in a way. But in this way, it's rather pathetic.
Yes.
But on the other hand, just listening to it, I realized that probably he was not the worst figure. For this time, yeah, it could be worse.
Yes, I think you're right. Absolutely.
Yeah, can I say a few words?
The last question, yeah.
Thank you very much. I've got so much to tell, but I haven't got time. That's why I want to concentrate on your problem that you have raised. I think that people like Groningen are very, very dangerous. There's a problem. Yes, I understand your question, but they are very, very... the same Hitler was Hitler. And if we look at the types of a person, they're adequate. They're the same type of a person. At the beginning, it looks like healing, but in the end, it ends with manipulation. It's not a real healing. The real healing should be pursued autrement, under healing.
No, I didn't mean to justify him. I say that's evil.
Yes, you have raised a very real problem. I don't, there's no contradiction with what you said. You just raised a problem. The problem is very deep because it's rooted in archetypes. Carl Gustav Jung,
many people said the same thing.
Yeah. Philosophically, it was a little bit Heidegger, but psychoanalytically, it was Carl Gustav Jung.
Yes.
And he was not pro-Nazi. He was not understood. He was not a Nazi, no. So there are lots of things that I would like to say, but I'll say it a bit later, maybe. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you. That was very, very interesting. Thank you. Hope you'll contribute to our conversation. Yeah, absolutely.